It's absolutely lovely to be here and welcome everyone. It's a delight to be chairing this. I have known Edwin for a number of years and I'm very much looking forward to hearing from Tara and Erfan as well and getting to know them. Edwin and I go back quite some time because we've both been very involved in interfaith work. I've worked for Interfaith Scotland and Edwin has volunteered for I don't know how many years for the Northern Irish Interfaith Forum. So we both have that interest at heart. A little bit about our speakers tonight. Edwin grew up in the small market town of Enniskillen in County Fermanagh, and with friends he was involved in community initiatives from a very early age. In 1987, life changed fundamentally for him when 12 friends and neighbours were killed as a result of the Remembrance Day bomb in that town. And of course, you'll all know that tonight the talk is about efforts at peace building in Northern Ireland from a Baha'i perspective, with a subtitle which is Servants to the Peace of the World. So Edwin, being a Baha'i, will have been very motivated to promote peace, but this terrible incident happening in his hometown again would have just increased that desire to see peace in the world. And Tara and Erfan Fadaei were both born into Baha'i families. Tara grew up in Northern Ireland in one of the most contested spaces during the conflict, the Garvaghy Road in Portadown, the scene of massive riots that brought all of Northern Ireland to a standstill. She worked for a period in London before returning to Belfast. Erfan grew up in England and lived for a year in Tanzania before moving to Belfast. They have both been instrumental in developing a programme of activities to support young people in the neighbourhood where they are living. So that's the background of our speakers tonight and the topic, but we would like very much to start with a prayer, and I'm going to invite Caroline Sperry-Gillis if she would please open with a prayer.
Thou provider, assist thou these noble friends to win thy good pleasure, and make them well-wishers of stranger and friend alike. Bring them into the world that abideth forever. Grant them a portion of heavenly grace. Cause them to be true Baha'is, sincerely of God. Save them from outward semblances, and establish them firmly in the truth. Make them signs and tokens of the kingdom, luminous stars above the horizon of this nether life. Make them to be a comfort and a solace to humankind and servants to the peace of the world.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Caroline. Edwin, would you like me to just say what the 6 parts of this evening are going to be, or would you like to do that yourself?
Yes, please go ahead, Maureen. That'll be very helpful.
Okay, so the evening's going to have, well, it says 6 parts on my sheet, but I think I've counted 5, so we'll go with 5. There's going to be an overview of the conflict, an overview of peace-building initiatives from a Baha'i perspective, some quotes and information on social action and non-involvement in partisan politics, local community building initiatives focusing on children and youth, and then concluding comments. So it now gives me great pleasure to hand over to Edwin. Are you starting this evening?
Yeah, I kick off, and hopefully Tara and Erfan will chip in along the way. And Tara and Erfan particularly will say they'll focus on the local community building activities that they've been involved with in the Belfast area later on. Good. Thanks. The prayer that Caroline read at the beginning is, you might have been able to read from the attributes at the end. So it's a prayer of Abdul Baha. It was written about 120 years ago, whenever Abdul Baha was writing to the Baha'is in the States. And it was quoted again by the Universal House of Justice just this year in March, when the Universal House of Justice sent out what Baha'is call a Nowruz letter, which is occasionally the Nowruz is the Baha'i New Year, and occasionally the Universal House of Justice sends out a Nowruz letter. So this year we had one, and the Universal House of Justice chose to include that prayer. And I think it's significant because of the last line in the prayer, and I think a lot of the quotes that I'm using have a significant last line. But the last line in that prayer is, make them, i.e. the friends of the faith, make them to be a comfort and a solace to humankind and servants to the peace of the world. And it really struck me whenever the Universal House of Justice sent that out in March that this was something Abdul Baha was saying such a long time ago. And we'll come back to that. The main part I'm going to focus on is the issue of social action and non-involvement in partisan politics, as Maureen says. But I want to start with this quote. This is one I came across really. It's a 20th century Buddhist writer, and he said, your negative acts are the source of all your suffering. However, it's possible to purify a negative act and thereby avoid suffering the otherwise unavoidable result. To purify a negative act, you must have a full set of the four opponent forces. These are recognizing exactly who you committed the act towards, regretting the act, resolving not to do it again, and taking refuge by thinking, speaking, and acting positively in the future towards the one whom we harmed. And that's from Baha'u'llah Rinpoche. So how does that relate to the peace process? So I think you can. I like it because it's a Buddhist quote. So it's external to Northern Ireland, and I think you can look at that from the context of Northern Ireland and ask which of those four opponent forces that Baha'u'llah Rinpoche describes, which of them are present in the Northern Ireland peace process. So one, recognizing exactly who the act was committed towards, who was the victim. Two, regretting the act. Three, resolving not to do it again. And four, speaking positively and acting positively in the future towards the victim. So a quick question for you. Use your chat box to put in 1, 2, 3, and 4. If you think all of them are present in Northern Ireland at the moment, you put in 1, 2, 3, and 4. If you think the first two are present, just put in 1 and 2. If you think none of them are present, put in a 0. And just very quickly do that, and I'll come back to that in a second. So I want to, while you're doing that, I want to look at something entirely different. So bear with me for a second. It's just taking me a sec to bring this up. Yeah, so there we go. Hopefully you're seeing this. So I wanted to show this as a timeline, just to put things in context. So there are a couple of people on the connection who aren't Baha'i. So I wanted to describe, at the beginning of the Baha'i faith, there were two founders, the Bab and Baha'u'llah. They lived contemporaneously. Baha'u'llah was born in 1817, the Bab in 1819. And whenever the Bab passed away, Baha'u'llah was the central figure in the Baha'i faith. And whenever he passed away, his son Abdul Baha was the sole interpreter of his teachings. And in turn, whenever Abdul Baha passed away, Shoghi Effendi was appointed guardian of the faith until he passed away in 1957. So that is a sort of sense of succession up until 1957, whenever Shoghi Effendi passed away. And before Shoghi Effendi passed away, he put in place the mechanism for establishing the Universal House of Justice, which now is elected every 5 years. It's elected and it carries the reins of the authority, the central authority for the faith. And it was first elected in 1963. So you had a little bit of a gap there between the passing of Shoghi Effendi and the election of the Universal House of Justice. And why I thought that's interesting is because whenever you look at the time frame of the Troubles in that context, you can see that, I'm just playing around with this a little bit to make it a little bit clearer. You can see that really the Troubles began very shortly after the Universal House of Justice was first established. And there are, on this time scale, I've marked in a couple of significant things. So One is the Office of Social and Economic Development was established at the World Centre, and a major statement on social and economic development was issued by the Universal House of Justice in 1983. The peace message was issued by the Universal House of Justice to the peoples of the world, talking about international peace in 1985, I think. And then in 2002, I think it was, the letter to the religious leaders of the world was issued. And those, I think, were three critical documents, but particularly the two, the peace message and the statement on social and economic development, really changed the way in which Baha'is, certainly changed the way in which a lot of people in Northern Ireland were thinking about social engagement, because we were really struggling up until that period. I want to go back, if I can, to the chat box, and maybe Maureen, you can help me to tell me what sort of results are coming through out of the chat box.
It seems to be mixed results. Some are saying all four, some are saying all four to a limited degree, some are saying none at all, that none of them are in place. And Keith, I think, probably would resonate if where he says all, but to a limited degree, maybe to a very limited degree. Keith's been involved in Derry through the Troubles for the last 50 years. So he says there's still much bitterness on both sides, but there are signs of hope evident. So sounds like a very mixed bag, Edwin. I don't know. My own comment was just that I'm not sure, but I wish it was all four of them. So you could maybe help us see which ones you think.
Maybe Tara and Erfan would like to unmute and tell us what they think.
Okay.
Well, we put 1, 2, and 4. We put a question mark at 3 because I was just considering the thought that if, for example, there was a very hard border put back in place, even though people do show regret and conform to those, to 1, 2, and 4, I imagine if that happened, they probably would still act in a violent way to get what they need. So I think they all exist at the moment, and people probably hope that they wouldn't do it again and resolve not to do it. But if the situation was such that they were provoked, then I can imagine it just blowing off again. That's why we question 3.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think in Northern Ireland you would get very mixed responses to that. But I think the reason I put that there is number one, I like the Buddhist quote. I think it's actually a very good quote, and in terms of looking at conflict resolution, those 4 points are very interesting points to bear in mind. But I think actually, for me, it's when I looked at that Buddhist quote and tried to apply it to Northern Ireland, it really flagged up for me that it's very much an unresolved conflict in Northern Ireland. If you compare it to other international conflicts, the one that comes to mind for me, obviously, is the Second World War, where Germans would be very, very determined that there wouldn't be anything of the nature of the Holocaust ever again. They would feel a great sense of guilt about what happened during the Holocaust, and they would be doing everything they possibly could to address the situation. We don't have that in Northern Ireland. We don't have that sense of guilt from the main protagonists. And there was no, the resolution of the conflict was an agreement that allowed both sides to retain their position. So neither side, in actual fact, the conflict was much more complex than being two sides, but there was none of the protagonists ever surrendered at the end of the conflict. So to that extent, conflict hasn't been resolved. And I think that's just saying that as a note at the outset to bear in mind. The next thing I want to go on to look at is, and this is a discussion that Tara and Erfan and I had, thinking about the legacy of the conflict, and so what remains after So the Good Friday Agreement happened in 1998. In 1994, 1995, we had the ceasefires. So notionally, we've had ceasefires since 1994 and 1995, although there has been some violence since then. And in fact, the most significant atrocity during the conflict happened after the Good Friday Agreement was signed. And yesterday was the anniversary of the Omagh bomb, which killed 29 people plus 2 unborn babies. So 31 souls were killed during the Omagh bomb. That was in 1998 after the Good Friday Agreement. I'm throwing out dates at you, but just to say that the conflict actually didn't end with the Good Friday Agreement. And the Good Friday Agreement, although it settled the political dispute, it didn't settle the conflict. So, as I said, Tara and I were thinking about some of the legacy issues. What's the legacy that's left from the conflict? So, maybe Tara and Erfan, you want to reflect some of those thoughts. They're looking at each other very blankly.
Maybe if you go on for a moment and I'll get my train of thought. You can
Okay.
start now.
Okay, that's fine. That's okay. So what I'm thinking about is we tend to think about the conflict as being resolved, but in fact, in Northern Ireland, after the conflict has been resolved, there are a lot of ways in which we continue to act as a consequence of the conflict, and we would take them in our stride and consider them to be sort of normal activities. But actually, whenever you look at them, they're actually not reflected in other normal societies. So I remember one of the discussions we had. Are you ready to chip in with something?
Yeah, good now.
Yeah, go for it.
Well, I can start. I guess one thing that's really specific to Northern Ireland itself is that generally schools are run either as a Catholic school or as like a state-run, like generally Protestant school, and then we have a few integrated schools which people who are of neither denomination often like hope to send their kids to, or people who really want to promote the peace process between the two will also send their children to an integrated primary school. But it is just like, it's very evident that you're either one or you're the other, and they're run very differently actually. And I think in many ways that kind of furthers the conflict in a way, that it hasn't been resolved, and when you really evaluate the school situation, because they're totally separate.
And then also past primary school as well, like there's different selection processes for different schools. So there'll be a different exam for going into like a Catholic school or a Protestant school.
You take
different exams, and then like there's separate training colleges for the teachers of those schools as well. So at all levels of education, maybe apart from university, the education can be segregated.
What you mean by that is that in Northern Ireland there are two teaching colleges where you train to become a teacher, and one is Catholic and really one is then state-run, more associated with being Protestant. So there's a massive divide that still exists, and I think we have a really long way to overcome that. And I think the way forward is probably unclear as to what way that will move and how that can actually change.
Another thing as well is like more physical aspects. So like we have peace walls that are separating the actual communities like physically. So they're big walls and big, barbed wires and steel like cages almost that separate the different communities. And they've increased in number and size since the Good Friday Agreement. And then like in the shops in the city centre, you'd see, they all have shutters and they would all be very secure after the time of shutting. And that's something that I had only really figured out that was different in Northern Ireland as opposed to like England. And that was something I only found out when Edwin mentioned it in our conversation, that I forgot really that England doesn't really have that in so many places, but in Northern Ireland it's just like everywhere.
When the shop closes, they put down the metal shutter.
Yeah.
I live in Scotland also has a little bit of a legacy of the conflict in Northern Ireland, because I live in Glasgow. And of course, that the conflict is manifest most particularly through two football teams, through Celtic and Rangers. And there's a sense of sectarian divide also here in the west coast of Scotland. But it's very much linked to, you know, prejudice that's quite a few hundred years old, really, you know, and particularly after the famines and the Irish coming over. And you know, a Catholic nun that I work very closely with in interreligious dialogue, her name is Sister Isabel Smythe. She remembers, and when she was a young child in Glasgow, that there were signs up. Say if there was a job advertised, it would say things like "No Catholics need apply here," or if there was bed and breakfast, it would be "No Catholics welcome," or, you know. So there was very, very obvious you know, prejudice particularly towards Catholics here in Scotland. So the sectarianism of the conflicts were it manifest themselves mostly just in the west of Scotland, but it's definitely still here. And it was very interesting that there's a Catholic writer called Hans Kuhn, which some of you may know, who said there will be no peace in the world without peace between religions, and there'll be no peace between religions without dialogue. So, you know, I think there's still an awful lot more roundtable talking to do by the sound of things in Northern Ireland. And I also often wonder, because I work in Holocaust and genocide education as well, that people often say education is a tool, you know, is a huge tool for peace building. But I often think education for what? It's the type of education. You know, the Catholic children are being educated, the Protestant children are being educated, but what is the education that they're receiving? So peace education is hugely important. The Nazis were incredibly well educated and still managed to murder an awful lot of people. So it has to be, you know, what is in the educational process that is changing the hearts of people, really, and making them want to build peace.
Yeah, we were talking about the legacy of the conflict and this segregated education, and like the potential that has. Like that segregated education started, of course, 100 years before the conflict started. But it's just leaving such an incredible legacy in terms of future generations. But so many other things that we view as being normal are just a legacy of the conflict. And one of the things that we were thinking about whenever we were talking about this was, if we're thinking like the conflict totally had a massive impact on society in Northern Ireland, but we're now experiencing something that's equally having a massive impact on society, which is the COVID pandemic. And it has totally changed our way of living. And the thought that struck us whenever we were talking about this is, to what extent are we going to have a COVID legacy of things in society that have totally changed, some of them for the better, but perhaps some of them for the worse, and they just get embedded in society? And that's maybe something that we can think about, you know, in the discussion afterwards. But coming back to Northern Ireland, I mentioned whenever we were looking at the timeline that the Universal House of Justice issued a statement that we refer to as the peace message. So it was issued in October 1985. And there's one line in it particular that I want to read. So it states, this will be familiar to the Baha'is that are here, but not familiar to everybody else. It states, whether peace is to be reached only after unimaginable horrors precipitated by humanity's stubborn clinging to old patterns of behaviour, or is to be embraced now by an act of consultative will, is the choice before all who inhabit the earth. So that was a statement in relation to international peace, but that statement was clearly saying that that peace was not something that was inevitable. It's a choice that people had to make, and people had to come together to work for it. And at the time, whenever that was issued, it had a profound impact, I think, on many Baha'is in Northern Ireland who are thinking, you know, if you apply that to the Northern Irish situation, it's really saying that we've got to act. We've got to, that peace is not just something that we can sit by and allow to happen, that others will do what's necessary, but, you know, that there's an urgency in acting on it. So that was 1985.
And I suppose what I'm leading up to saying is that in the early years, the early decades of the conflict, so the conflict began, and the actual start date for the conflict is variously put at different pointers, but generally people would say it began around 1968. So there were 3 decades. The Good Friday Agreement was in 1998. So in the first decade, from 1968 to 1978, there was really, like, everything was being turned upside down. The parliament in Stormont was dissolved, direct rule came in, the army came in, internment happened, and society as we knew it was totally changed very quickly. And across faith communities, I think it's probably fair to say that all faith communities were struggling with that, and different faith communities responded in different ways. And probably the best example was Corrymeela, that was actually formed before the conflict by a chaplain in Queen's University in Belfast, the Reverend Ray Davey, established it as an interchurch project to bring students together from Catholic and Protestant backgrounds, and it thrived as a reconciliation centre during the conflict. The other outstanding example, and from a faith perspective, was the work of the Quaker community, the Society of Friends, particularly in providing support for families, because whenever internment happened, lots of people were in prison, and they were in prison in places that were very inaccessible from Belfast. So the Quakers set up a service to transport prisoner families in minibuses from the centre of Belfast out to Longkesh or up to McGilligan. And you had in these minibuses Protestant families and Catholic families together. And the Quakers provided amazing prison service support during that period. But with those, if you set aside some of those amazing examples that developed at the beginning, most other faith communities were really struggling to make sense of what was happening, and really struggling to strike a balance between becoming politically aligned and being able to respond, because the conflict was aligned so clearly with Protestant and Catholic. People were trying to respond in a way which wasn't aligning them politically, and they were being sucked in, and there were lots of negative things happening from a faith perspective, and people were really struggling to try and transcend that. In the Baha'i community, I think Hazel is in this connection, and I remember Hazel once describing whenever some of the areas in Belfast were being burnt in the riots, she got a phone call from Jane Villiers-Stewart, I think, or maybe from Elizabeth, but she got a phone call to say that she's a young woman with a car, and car owners were pretty rare at the time, and could she help to provide some transport for some of the families that were suffering. So the Baha'i community was responding in sort of charitable ways like that. There was a charity shop in the university area called War and Want, which really sort of provided, like, basically families were being burnt out and they had nothing, and it provided the basic needs for them to survive for a couple of days. So people were responding in that sort of way at a basic charity level, but there was a lot of really head scratching going on in terms of how faith communities could respond in a wider level. And that was through the first decade, and I would say right through into the second decade. And it was in the mid-80s, I think, that all faith communities began to think about things in a different way. And there were a number of things that were happening that were causing that. So the government was beginning to open up back channels of communication with Sinn Féin. And this was beginning to become more evident. John Hume initiated talks with Gerry Adams, and I'll come back to John Hume. John passed away just 10 days ago. Yeah. I'll go back to that later. He did amazing work in developing. John he just worked tirelessly for peace, but he opened up a channel with Gerry Adams and suffered incredibly politically because of it. So there were political things like that were beginning to surface, and that gave a lot of voluntary organisations the courage to put their heads up and do something. And I describe it in three ways, that the activity was happening at that political level. It was also happening at the government level, so the British government engaging with the Irish government, but also engaging with the American government. The American government became key, and also the European Union was key at that time. And the Norwegian government also played a key role. So there's that government level. And in my mind, the political level and the government level is quite separate, because the politics in Northern Ireland didn't connect with government. There was direct rule from Westminster. Local politicians weren't elected to power, so they were separated. But the third strand, and for the purposes of this talk, the third strand is the most important. It's what I would describe as the NGO strand. So it's community groups and voluntary organisations and faith groups who were taking the initiative, and often with a high level of risk. So the Peace People formed in 1975-76. There were lots of other peace initiatives of various types that were beginning to develop and form and do very outstanding work. One of the ones that comes to mind is the Peace Train organisation, because the trains between Belfast and Dublin were regularly disrupted with bomb scares on the railway lines. So the Peace Train organisation created a project to actually demonstrate against that, and they took tickets and took a train down to Dublin on a regular basis just to challenge the way in which the trains were being disrupted. So there were amazing things that were happening on the ground. From a Baha'i perspective, there were a couple of peace building initiatives that I want to, and there were many, but I just want to refer to some of them if I can. So let's see if I can screen share this, because I think it'll be easier to understand if I screen share it, I think. Just give me a second. There we go. So this is just an example of some that I've put out of the top of my head, and whenever Tara and I and Erfan were talking about these sort of jumped out. So the mention has already been made of a Remembrance Day bomb in Enniskillen, and there was a Baha'i in Kendal, I think, called Frank Crossland, and whenever he came over, he was our retired teacher. He came over from England and spent, I think he came over on two separate occasions. First time he came over for a week, he met Gordon Wilson, whose daughter had just been killed. But he visited schools, he visited all of the schools in the area with a puppet show. You'd never be allowed to do that now because of child protection stuff. But Frank just brought a puppet show with him and just visited the schools and entertained the pupils, you know. An absolutely amazing individual. The other example that came to mind was Eddie Byrne, that organised a march for peace in Portadown on the Garvaghy Road, which you heard about earlier. I want to come back to the Upsell Commission responses. I'll come back to it. Jane Villiers-Stewart was involved in discussions locally in the North Antrim area that really were instrumental in supporting local dialogue and getting Protestants and Catholics to come together to look at ways forward. And in Fourth Spring is an area on the Springfield Road, which is quite strange in Belfast, because it's on that road, most parts of Belfast are either totally Protestant or totally Catholic. Fourth Spring is a mixture. It's a very polarized area, but there parts of the road are Protestant, other parts of the road are Catholic. And Pippa got involved in a project that brought the Protestant and Catholic parts of the road together. The other list there that I have, and this is very significant, like I saw Dara posted on the chat box to say that 7% of the population, of 7% of the children in Northern Ireland go to integrated schools. So integrated means it's a school where Protestants and Catholics go together. So only 7% go to those schools. But they're absolutely key, and they were developing 7 versus 70, he says. They were developing through the 80s. The Enniskillen one was formed after the Remembrance Day bomb. The Portrush was formed just before Enniskillen. Portadown was formed before that. But in that list, Enniskillen, Omagh, Magherafelt, Newcastle, Hazelwood and Derry, there were Baha'is involved in all of those integrated schools in one way or another. There was a Baha'i that was a founder member of the Northern Ireland Council of Integrated Education, and many Baha'is were founder members of those schools, and served on the board of trustees of the schools, and still do. So that wasn't an institutional thing, it was just families with children that were seeking to get a balanced education. The final point on that list that I want to refer to, if I can, well, before I get to that, I want to come back to the Upsell Commission. So when in the 90s, there was a growing sense that there was a need to generate some ideas about the future, and there was an NGO and a voluntary initiative that got significant funding to do a bit of research to get views from across the board, from politicians, from government, from statutory bodies, from voluntary organisations, from community groups, from faith organisations, from trade unions, from everywhere. And the amazing thing is that Nick Sanders, and Nick I think is in this connection, so hello Nick, but Nick did an incredible bit of work to mobilise Baha'i communities across Northern Ireland, and the Baha'i population in Northern Ireland is tiny. But there were 12 different Baha'i communities that made a response to the Upsell Commission. So that was more or less total, all of the Baha'i institutions in Northern Ireland were responding to this Upsell Commission, named after Torkel Upsell, who was a Norwegian politician, and he was the chair of the Upsell Commission. And absolutely amazing responses that stimulated a lot of discussion within the Baha'i community, as well as making those responses. But it was a first-class example of where the Baha'i community responded as an institution. Other initiatives were individual initiatives, but with the Upsell Commission responses, it was an institutional response. So I want to move on to this last bullet point. So this is in 2006. It's quite a bit after the Good Friday Agreement, but what happened was after the Good Friday Agreement in October 2002, the Assembly was suspended. It collapsed between 2002 and 2007. And that period, the Assembly continued to meet, the parties continued to meet, but not as, like they weren't an official assembly. They were continuing to meet in inter-party talks. And I think what was significant was that there was a lot of community interest in seeing, like there was a very strong desire to get the assembly back up and running again from a community perspective. But the talks were generating more heat than light, I think it's fair to say. But there was, I think at the time, it's probably fair to say, and I know there are a couple of people here from other faith communities in Northern Ireland. It'd be interesting to hear your perspective on this, but I think it's probably fair to say that at the time, a lot of faith communities were very keen to see progress. And I've heard that there were a number of faith communities that were actively praying for progress to be made in those talks. The chair, the speaker in the assembly was Eileen Bell at the time. And through one, like, not to make a long story, but one way or another, the Baha'i community was invited to have a reception in Parliament Buildings, which is Stormont, which is the base of the assembly. The assembly wasn't meeting, the parties were meeting, but the assembly wasn't meeting. And we were invited to have this reception. And we invited a number of guests to join us. And there was a selection of prayers and readings and some music sung by a choir, and then some very nice refreshments afterwards. And Eileen Bell hosted it. And for the event, there was a very nice little booklet put together with prayers. And there was a lot of discussion in advance about which prayers should be included. And one of the prayers that was put in will be familiar to the Baha'is in this connection. So it begins with, "O Lord, make this assemblage radiant." And that prayer was added in. It's a prayer that Baha'is would normally use for Baha'i assembly meetings. So whenever local communities elect a body to govern their affairs, it's called a local assembly. So it's a prayer that Baha'is would use for Baha'i assemblies. But we put it in that booklet, and it has an obvious implication for the Stormont Assembly. So we had that event, and 6 months later, the Assembly reformed. So the Assembly reformed in May 2007. That event was in November 2006. Sometime after that, I'm sorry this is getting a little bit long-winded, but I'm coming to the end. Sometime after that, Eileen Bell was at another Baha'i meeting, and she made a point of finding some Baha'is to talk to. And she described how she kept that little booklet with her during the all-party talks that were happening in Parliament Buildings at the time. And she described how sometimes the talks would get extremely fraught, and what she would do is she would lift her papers, delegate her role to the deputy speaker, and disappear out quietly to the room at the back that's reserved for the speaker. And she would read that prayer. And she said that she found that transformed her whole feeling and the way in which she responded. And whenever she went back into the assembly, she felt that from that moment on, the assembly, the discussions, she says the discussions in the assembly from that Monday following the meeting were much more constructive and ended up coming to an agreement. So I'm just throwing that in. I'm not suggesting that was what caused the assembly to reform, because I know that other faith communities were also praying at the time, but it was just a lovely way in which you can see that prayers, no matter where they're coming from, that you can see the value of prayers, and that in Eileen's case, it was having a transformative effect on her role as speaker, and she was able to respond positively. So that's just a little anecdote for you. As I said, there were amazing things happening at the time. And let's see where we are. Yeah, so I've covered some of this. So there was a commonality, I think, across faith communities in relation to some of the challenges and how they would respond. There was a great sensitivity in relation to political involvement. And there was a desire by activists on the ground, by some activists, to be directly involved. But this last bullet point is probably of interest to the Baha'is in the audience. I think the prevailing wisdom, I think, in the Baha'i community in Northern Ireland at the time was that Baha'is should not be involved in politics, that it was divisive, that anything you got involved in was going to end up putting the Baha'i community on one side or the other. And bear in mind, the Baha'i community was struggling very, very hard to remain independent, to remain neutral in the conflict, not to be aligned with either Catholic or Protestant. So the prevailing wisdom was that Baha'is should not be involved in anything to do with politics, but that extended to any involvement in peace initiatives, because the prevailing wisdom at the time was they could end up being political. But as I described, there were a number of individuals that were involved in things regardless of the prevailing wisdom. Individuals who just got involved. And there were at least 3 separate occasions that I'm aware of, and there were probably more, but there was 3 separate occasions that I'm aware of when the Universal House of Justice wrote directly to the National Assembly to commend the initiatives that some individuals were involved in. So and remember the timeline. So the Universal House of Justice had really only been established relatively recently. And at that time, they were responding very positively whenever they were seeing any indication of Baha'is being engaged. They were responding very, very positively, and there was never a question from the Universal House of Justice about political involvement in those letters. So I want to move on to the next section, and in this there are a couple of quotes, and we'll maybe see if we can find somebody that can help with some of them. This first quote that I'm using, it's addressed to an individual, and I'm using it because it sets the question of political involvement into the context of the writings of Baha'u'llah and Abdul Baha and Shoghi Effendi. So it's setting the historical basis for the Universal House of Justice taking the position that it took. I have reformatted it. This is not the original formatting, as you might guess. And the bit in bold is the bit that's the direct quote, first of all from Baha'u'llah, and then later from Abdul Baha. So I'll just cut to those. So Baha'u'llah is quoted here as saying, "Be anxiously concerned with the needs of the age you live in, and center your deliberations on its exigencies and requirements." So the Universal House of Justice is using that quote to say that Baha'is must be involved. And then Abdul Baha says that the friends should become distinguished in all the virtues of the human world, for their faithfulness and sincerity, for their justice and fidelity, for firmness and steadfastness, for philanthropic deeds and service to the human world, for love toward every human being, for unity and accord with all people, and for removing prejudices and promoting international peace. And then the final quote there is from The Guardian, not the final quote actually, there are 2 from The Guardian. The first one is, much as the friends must guard against in any way seeming to identify themselves or their cause with any political party, they must also guard against the other extreme of never taking part with other progressive groups in conferences or in committees designed to promote some activity in entire accord with our teachings. And then this quote from The Guardian, in the context of race protests and demonstrations in the States, he says, "No objection at all to the students taking part in something so obviously akin to the spirit of our teachings as a campus demonstration against race prejudice." And then the final line in this quote is from the Universal House of Justice, where the Universal House of Justice says, "Baha'is must therefore be tireless in addressing through word and deed a range of social issues." And that's 23rd of December 2008. This one to an individual from Universal House of Justice again. Like these are quite lengthy letters, and actually it's worth looking at the entire letter. But the excerpt that I have here is, "Members of the Baha'i community, wherever they reside, avoid engaging in partisan politics or meddling in political relations among governments, refraining at all times from becoming involved in the context for worldly power. This choice is not intended as a criticism of any political party or of the approach taken by other groups." And it's that line about, this is not a criticism of politics. It's not a criticism of party politics. It's not a criticism of individuals that are involved in party politics. And that line, I think, often gets lost in Baha'i discourses around politics. And it's again, I think, in this one, the principles of non-involvement in politics and obedience to government, far from being obstacles to social change or aspects of an approach set forth in the Baha'i writings to implement effective remedies for and address the root causes of the ills afflicting society. This approach includes active involvement in the life of society, as well as the possibility of influencing and contributing to the social policies of government by all lawful means. Indeed, service to others and to society is a hallmark of the Baha'i life. And Shoghi Effendi has explained that the machinery of the cause has been so fashioned that whatever is deemed necessary to incorporate into it in order to keep it to the forefront of progressive movements can, according to the provisions made by Baha'u'llah, be safely embodied therein. So sorry for so much reading, but perhaps, Maureen, we could find somebody. There are just a couple of paragraphs here, so maybe somebody could read these.
All right, I can invite someone, or I can read for you because I can see it up here on my screen if you like, Edwin. Would that be helpful?
Okay. Yes, that'll be good.
Okay.
It'll give me a little bit of a clue as well. So this one is a letter to the Baha'is in Iran. It's a very long letter, and it sets out in detail the whole issue of engagement in politics as well as other things. And it's really well worth reading in its entirety. So go ahead. I've just excerpted a few lines out of it. Go ahead, Maureen.
The principle of the oneness of humankind, as proclaimed by Baha'u'llah, asks not merely for cooperation among people and nations, it calls for a complete reconceptualization of the relationships that sustain society. Baha'is do not seek political power. They will not accept political posts in their respective governments, though they will take up positions which they deem to be purely administrative in nature. They will not affiliate themselves with political parties, become entangled in partisan issues, or participate in programs tied to the divisive agendas of any group or faction. At the same time, Baha'is respect those who, out of a sincere desire to serve their countries, choose to pursue political aspirations or to engage in political activity. The approach adopted by the Baha'i community of non-involvement in such activity is not intended as a statement expressing some fundamental objection to politics in its true sense. Indeed, humanity organizes itself through its political affairs. Baha'is vote in civil elections as long as they do not have to identify themselves with any party in order to do so. In this connection, they view government as a system for maintaining the welfare and orderly progress of a society.
Thanks, Maureen. That's great. And then there's this quote which the Baha'is would probably be familiar with. So this was in the context of the pandemic. The Universal House of Justice wrote to all national assemblies on the 9th of May, just this year. So they said, when society is in such difficulty and distress, the responsibility of the Baha'is to make a constructive contribution to human affairs becomes more pronounced. This is a moment when distinct but interrelated lines of action converge upon a single point, when the call to service rings loud. The individual, the community, and the institutions of the faith, inseparable protagonists in advancement of civilization, are all in a position to demonstrate the distinctive features of the Baha'i way of life, characterized by increased maturity in the discharge of their responsibilities and their relationships with each other. They are summoned to a fuller expression of the faith's society-building powers. So what I've done here is just extracted some of the key lines out of those letters. And whenever you put them together, it's a very strong message, encouraging this text that's here is all direct quotes from the Universal House of Justice, encouraging the believers to contribute to the betterment of the world. The central purpose of the Baha'i community is social transformation. Indeed, service to others and to society is a hallmark of the Baha'i life. Baha'is must therefore be tireless in addressing through word and deed a range of social issues. And then the last one that I've just looked at is saying it's not only the individual, it's the individual, the community, and the institutions of the faith are summoned to a fuller expression of the faith's society-building powers. So the conclusion from all of that is that there's a very strong imperative for Baha'is as a global community and as local Baha'is to be involved in social action for the betterment of society. And there are a number of ways that Baha'is do that. So part of it is responding to conflicts and crises in society. So, for example, the peace initiatives in Northern Ireland, or responding to the pandemic in a variety of ways, is part of it. The other part of it is the processes that the Baha'i community is engaged in at a local level to build community. And it's those that sort of community building processes that I think we want to turn to just for the last part of this presentation, if we have time to do that. So over to Tara and Erfan, perhaps.
Thanks, Edwin.
Okay, well, like I guess specifically, what we're going to focus on is like practically what does it look like to peace build, like have peace building in a like neighbourhood in Northern Ireland. And ultimately, I guess the question that we needed to ask ourselves as a team of people working in Northern Ireland was the same as really anyone, and that was like, how do we build a vibrant community and create social transformation, particularly in one neighbourhood in Belfast. And I guess common to all Baha'i inspired programmes, you follow the Institute process, which has 4 main programmes, which are having classes for children, having programmes for junior youth, 11 to like 15-year-olds, prayer meetings, and study circles. So really that's really the line that we followed as instructed by the House of Justice.
Yeah, and then some of the things that so these are common to all areas in the world. Baha'is and their friends are involved in community building processes using social the core activities all around the world. So what are some of the things that are specific to our neighbourhood, which is called Windsor neighbourhood in Belfast? So some of the things that we were just thinking about was so we've got very good relationships with the community centre in the Windsor neighbourhood, and the community leader is very sympathetic to the activities of the Baha'i community and has really basically endorsed it and has used or encouraged the use of the local community centre for Baha'i activities in the neighbourhood
for free,
and has also helped organise lots of activities for the children and the junior youth that attend those activities in the centre. And then we've been working in a community garden in the neighbourhood, and that's really just to bring together a diverse group of people within the neighbourhood that have a desire to contribute to something that is positive, and that's led to really people from diverse backgrounds coming together,
particularly youth recently. So I think like the whole COVID pandemic meant that we all needed to meet outside. So the garden has existed for maybe 4 years, and really recently it's really just come to life because out of necessity. So it's in a very visible place, and people from all walks of life come past that and have become involved in trying to do some gardening and like grow some plants and vegetables just to share. I guess one thing just worthy of note is, I suppose, like where this neighbourhood is situated would have originally been a very Protestant area actually, and since as time has progressed, there's been a lot of migration, and particularly into that area. So there's people from Africa, all continents really. We'll get Nigerians, then Romanian, what other,
Sudanese,
Polish. So the particular area where we're working and where this garden is situated and where the community centre is situated is now very multicultural. But just across a bridge, the bridge just separates us to a very Protestant area, and it's very sectarian. But again, it is beginning to become more multicultural. And I guess what we're working on as a team of individuals with the Baha'i Inspired Project is to really help, I guess, these neighbourhoods come together and recognise really that, you know, it's not just about bringing the Catholics and Protestants together or the people from different countries, but it's really just bringing together everyone to become unified, regardless of nationality, regardless of anything else.
Yeah, so like, I mean, we focused a lot in this fireside about the specific divide between Catholic and Protestant communities, and I think it really goes beyond that. Really, in any communities where Baha'is are working around the world, it's not maybe focused on specific divides or prejudices that are occurring in that place, but also, I mean, the vision of the Baha'i faith is to unite all the peoples of the world. So really the vision of the Friends working in the neighbourhood is really to bring all communities together, regardless of background, of race or ethnicity or class or religion.
And something maybe that's been really nice is that in Windsor neighbourhood has become quite strong in learning to accompany other people to, you know, take initiative and begin like some sort of avenue of service. And so now we have like mothers from various religions and backgrounds teaching children from everywhere, and I guess that's really beautiful. Yeah. And then we'll talk a little bit about the Junior Youth Programme in the neighbourhood. I guess here we've written a little bit about the idea that the village being very segregated by a religious divide compared to where we are, which is very deeply rooted. You know, it's one of those places that if you live there and you're not a Protestant, you know, you might get like a petrol bomb put outside your door and, you know, you'll have to leave. And that still exists, but gradually it is beginning to change. And we've definitely worked with people who have lived in that area, who have come over the bridge, I guess, to work where we are. And with really the hope of building a vibrant community that includes everyone. In terms of junior youth, we have worked with junior youth who have been from Protestant families and from Catholic families, and definitely, I guess, some would have gone to Catholic schools, some would have gone to Protestant schools, and the nature of, as we've spoken about, of the programme is just that it has brought them together. And I'm actually just going to have to go and get my daughter to sleep. Erfan will continue.
Lou has just woken up there, so Tara needs to go attend to that. So one thing I was just thinking of there was, and so these junior youth have been involved in these junior youth groups, but an interesting thing is that I don't think it's such a big thing in their minds now. I know that there is definitely an understanding that there are different communities, but it hasn't been like in the past where if there's, you know, a community like a Protestant, you can't go because you're a Catholic. So they're not divided in that way anymore. So I think maybe with the next generation coming, you know, growing up, it seems that maybe the tension or the extremeness of the views are sort of starting to fade away, and junior youth are growing up in these sorts of neighborhoods and are really interacting, which is really like great to see, and it doesn't seem to be such a problem.
I think it's actually incredible whenever you put the Northern Ireland religious conflict into the context of a multi-ethnic community. And I see somebody in the chat box saying it's not a religious conflict, it's a denominational conflict because Christianity is just one religion. But whenever you put that into the context of a multi-ethnic community, the differences between Protestant and Catholic just sort of dissolves away and becomes much less significant, which is why sort of a multi-ethnic approach is so much more valuable, you know.
I think
that's pretty much really what we had to say, but
Mm-hmm.
just really, I guess, just gradually as the Baha'i community and everyone involved from all walks of life have been involved in just really implementing the Baha'i principles in an area, like you feel an energy from it, and
Mm-hmm.
like people, as we said, like people's hearts they're changed and they're softened. So often, you know, when you have the historic like conflict that kind of like hardens people's hearts and they like build barriers, you can definitely feel that the love and the hope like inspires change. And I guess like essentially like it melts someone's heart, doesn't it, whenever they want to contribute to something greater than themselves. And there's definitely a feeling of that in the neighbourhood, and everyone that becomes involved feels that energy. And it's quite infectious, I think, and people are drawn to it. And I guess that's really just it, is that's what peace building looks like in Belfast. And in many ways, you know, it's very similar to other places in the world, and in some ways it will have its own particular avenues that we need to work on that might be slightly different. But I think ultimately we're all like endeavouring to do the same thing and coming across very similar challenges. And the result is just that by bringing the principles into a neighbourhood in a systematic and consistent way, you see change. And that's it really. So thanks, Edwin.
Thank you. So I thought we might finish with two poems. The first one is by Seamus Heaney, and the second one is by Aidan Hume. So I'll maybe pass over to, I think Caroline is going to read the Seamus Heaney one. I'll screen share, but there's a typo in my screen share on some of the text of Seamus Heaney's poem, but Caroline is going to read the correct version. And then we'll look at the John Hume, the Aidan Hume one. So this is the title of the poem is The Cure at Troy by Seamus Heaney. Seamus Heaney was a Nobel Peace, Nobel winning poet. Yes.
Human beings suffer. They torture one another. They get hurt and get hard. No poem or play or song can fully right a wrong inflicted and endured. The innocent in jails beat on their bars together. A hunger striker's father stands in the graveyard dumb. The police widow in veils faints at the funeral home. History says, don't hope on this side of the grave. But then, once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. So hope for a great sea change on the far side of revenge. Believe that further shore is reachable from here. Believe in miracle and cures and healing wells. Call miracles self-healing, the utter, self-revealing double take of feeling. If there's fire on the mountain or lightning and storm, and a God speaks from the sky, that means someone is hearing the outcry and the birth cry of new term, new life at its term.
Thank you, Caroline. So I think there are a couple of slightly different versions of this poem, and on this version, so this was taken from a reading by Seamus Heaney, and then the printed version in different publications vary slightly. But the key line in this is the line, "The longed for tidal wave of justice can rise up and hope and history rhyme." And in this version, that line is repeated at the last. It means that once in a lifetime, that justice can rise up and hope and history rhyme. And I'm saying that that's the key line because that's the line that Bill Clinton used whenever he visited Northern Ireland in 1995. After the ceasefires, he came to Northern Ireland and he switched on the Christmas tree lights, and he, in his speech, he made reference to that. So, and for people in Northern Ireland, that line is, I think, embedded in our mind and associated with the peace process, that line of justice can rise up and hope and history rhyme. And the second poem is in tribute to John Hume, who passed away just 10 days ago. And his son wrote this poem, and it was read at the funeral by one of his other sons. Sorry, by his daughter at the funeral, because Aidan, the son, was in the States and couldn't get over because of COVID. He couldn't get over for the funeral. So perhaps Jeremy might be able to read this one.
Hi Edwin, could you say who's going to read this one again? It may not be clear to them.
Okay. Yeah, I think Jeremy Fox is.
I'll start again. Right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. To Dad, your friend Seamus Heaney wrote of a time when justice will rise up and hope and history rhyme. Using a moral compass as your only tether, it was your perseverance and sheer force of will that brought them together. It began with a corrupt sighting at the university, driven by a total lack of respect for diversity. Then on to Stormont, Strasbourg, Westminster, even Washington, D.C. You showed us just how impactful one man can be. You made us realize a border is just a line on a map. It's in our hearts and minds where we need to bridge the gap. Over 30 years of violence, hurt, and unrelenting stress, those underlying conditions you never stopped trying to address. Difference is but an accident of birth, and everyone has the right to the same self-worth. Patriotism is the spilling of sweat, not blood. The glory of the gun is a myth that is truly a dud. You did not do it all alone, but made damn sure the seeds were sown. Leadership is the art of convincing others you're right, not being prisoner to a base or projecting might. Like any father-son, our relationship was occasionally frayed, but we were all grateful that on the course you stayed and showed us that even a wee boy from the glen could dismantle the power of the sword with a simple pen. I don't ever think I said aloud how you've made us all so incredibly proud. All you ever wanted was to make the world a better place. And in that goal, you found your ace. Aidan Hume, the 5th of August, 2020.
Really beautiful. Thank you, Edwin and Erfan, and let me see if I can get your name pronounced correctly.
Tara.
Tara, that's right. Tara and Erfan and Edwin and everyone for coming along. It's been really lovely.